Right friends, welcome back to News Analysis. This is the 10th week and this week the topic is Raghuram Rajan ready for monetary expansion? Last week we discussed about the fiscal expansion or fiscal consolidation. That means government has not voted for fiscal expansion and government has gone for fiscal consolidation. What we have learned last week, that is 9th week, and this week we are going to deliberate about the monetary expansion. And before going into it, let us look at these aspects. What are the GDP growth drivers? Last week I told you GDP growth will depend upon fiscal policy, monetary policy, but the third point I would like to add, the country's structural constraints or structural bottlenecks will also play a vital role, and for a country like India we have several structural bottlenecks, and eliminating those structural bottlenecks is very much essential for a country like India. So, I have divided entirely the GDP growth drivers into three parts. One is fiscal policy. Basically, it is spending more money for capital assets or for creation of capital assets. Second one is monetary policy, which looks at putting more money into circulation. Third one is eliminating structural bottlenecks. And with regard to the fiscal policy, last week what we have discussed is basically government should spend more on creation of capital assets through its resources. Fundamental fiscal prudence says that government out of its resources should spend more on capital assets. Government normally spends more on subsidies, salaries, like that. Most of the expenditure will go for day-to-day expenses. Very little will be left for creation of capital assets. So, in our country or in a country like India, the budgetary resources through its earnings for capital assets is very less. That's why what the governments will do is they will go for market borrowing, and the money borrowed they will spend on capital assets or for creation of assets. That is what the governments are doing, and this is popularly known as a deficit financing. What India is following is deficit financing, and last week we discussed fiscal deficit. Government kept at 3.5% so as to bring it down to 3% by 2017-18. Why it is 3%? Because FRBM Act stipulates the fiscal deficit target of 3%. Government wants to bring it down to 3% by 2017-18. That's why government kept limit on the borrowing, or you can say the limit on fiscal deficit. That means the money available for creation of capital assets is less. That's why we have to look at other options for GDP growth. So, in a nutshell, in fiscal policy, government kept the fiscal deficit target of 3.5%, due to which the government's power to borrow more money is reduced. That's why in fiscal policy, the growth driver with more spending is limited, right? If you look at the GDP growth, the first one is fiscal policy. If you look at the structural deficiencies, I will take up monetary policy little later, and let us look at what is the meaning of eliminating structural bottlenecks. These are very much specific for a country like India. We are facing these problems day in and day out, and these are the problems which are there for the past 50-60 years, and it is not possible to eliminate them within 1 or 2 years, but if government strive hard, they can be eliminated in due course of time. Right friends, what are the structural bottlenecks? First one is ensure competition, innovation in businesses. Ensuring competition and innovation is very important. In India, this innovation is very much less. Our education is not supporting innovation. That is the biggest problem. Our businesses are also not competitive. If you look at the second important point, we are not spending more on education and health. Very important point. Expenditure in research and development is also less in our country, and education and health expenditure is less. That's why our human capital is limited. That is the second biggest problem. Third one is eliminate multiplicity of taxes, and GST, goods and services tax, is a step in that direction. Fourth one is bring bankruptcy code. When the industry is suffering, failures in businesses is quite common. When failure is common, there should be a mechanism to bring the business out of its problems also. For that particular purpose, this bankruptcy code is required in our country. Then if you look at the next point, faster solution to industrial disputes. Industrial disputes should be resolved in faster manner. In European countries, arbitration cases will be resolved very fast, but in our country it takes somewhere around 5 to 15 years. So, solving industrial disputes at a faster pace is another important requirement. Then next one is bring rural hinterland to the mainstream by proper physical and social connectivity. This is also very important. Rural hinterland is to be connected. Last but not the least is develop world-class infrastructure. This is very important. So these are the structural bottlenecks. Please be careful to understand. For GDP growth, there are three aspects. One is fiscal policy, what we have discussed last week. Second important point is eliminating structural bottlenecks in the economy. These cannot be removed in single year or 2 years. It is continuous process. If governments strive continuously, these can be eliminated over a period of 5 to 10 years, and some may take 20 years also. So, this eliminating structural bottlenecks in one single year is not possible, right? And what else is left over? The third important aspect is monetary expansion, and I have dealt these structural bottlenecks first, then I have gone for this monetary policy. And fiscal policy looks at putting more money for creation of assets like creating world-class infrastructure, creating factories, improving rural infrastructure, improving irrigation facilities, basically spending more money on capital assets is the tenet of fiscal policy, and the tenet of monetary policy is bring more money into circulation. The monetary expansion is exactly bringing more money into circulation. Bring more money into the hands of the people, hands of the industry, into the hands of corporate people. Bring more money out into circulation. Then what will happen? If the money is there in circulation, if more money is there into the hands of the people, then more demand for goods will be created. When there is more demand for goods is created, ultimately more production will be there. Because of more production, this GDP will increase. So the essence of monetary expansion, or you can say monetary policy, is bring more money into circulation, which will ultimately result in more demand for goods, and ultimately production will be more. That's why GDP will increase. This is the essence of monetary policy. And because of more money in circulation, this GDP will grow, and at the same time there will be inflation also. But at present inflation is not the problem. Inflation is under control at around 4.8%, 4.9% if you look at it as average for 2015-16. So therefore, there is a case for putting more money into the hands of the people through monetary policy. And you may ask one point, what is opposite of monetary expansion? This monetary expansion is sometimes called expansionary monetary policy, right? And the opposite is contractionary monetary policy. When inflation is more, RBI will suck money from the system. That is contractionary monetary policy. Then growth will reduce. In expansionary monetary policy or monetary expansion, what the RBI will do is, it will put more money into the hands of the people, then ultimately GDP will take place. But the biggest problem is inflation. But at this juncture, inflation is not the problem. That's why nobody need to worry about inflation, right? And monetary expansion, how is it possible? I have already told you, to put more money into the hands of the people is the essence of monetary expansion, and it can be done in three ways. One is reducing reserve ratios. Second one is reducing policy rates. Third one is through open market operations. Reducing reserve ratios like CRR, SLR, then reducing policy rates like repo rate, reverse repo rate, bank rate. Then third one is open market operations. Open market operations, Reserve Bank of India undertake quite frequently as and when it feels liquidity is into problems. When Reserve Bank of India feels there is not much liquidity in the system, Reserve Bank will come to know about a liquidity problem when the call money rates increase in the market. Call money rate is when one bank is borrowing from another bank, that is call money. When call money rates are increasing in the market, that gives a signal that liquidity is not much in the system. So, under those circumstances, Reserve Bank of India will go for this open market operations of purchasing bonds from the market. Purchasing government bonds from the market will solve the problem of liquidity. So, that is normally undertaken as and when some liquidity problem is there by Reserve Bank of India. And I am interested and people are bothered about this reducing reserve ratios and reducing policy rates. People always talk about these two things, and we are going to deliberate about 1 and 2. What is meant by reserve ratio? Reserve ratio is cash reserve ratio and statutory liquidity ratio. This is basically pertaining to banking system. In the banking system, 4% of money, if people are depositing 100 crores into the banking system, then they have to keep 4 crores of rupees separately in cash form with Reserve Bank. Separate account with Reserve Bank, banks have to keep 4% of the money in separate account with Reserve Bank of India. And statutory liquidity ratio? Statutory liquidity ratio is each and every bank has to maintain 21.5% of the total deposits either in cash form, gold form or in government approved securities. So, these two are basically reserve ratios, and at present they are 4% and 21.5%. And if you look at the banking system, the total deposits in the banking system are around 90 lakh crores of rupees. The total deposits in the banking system at present 90 lakh crores of rupees. At present cash reserve ratio is 4%. And these two are very much required for liquidity and solvency of the banks. For ensuring solvency and liquidity of the banks, this SLR and CRR are very much essential, but Reserve Bank can increase or reduce depending on the requirement. Depending on the need for money circulation, Reserve Bank of India can go for reducing these ratios, and sometimes they can go for increasing these ratios also. And let us take for example, if CRR is reduced to 3%, at present the CRR is 4%. Let us assume Reserve Bank of India reduced CRR to 3%. That means the CRR is reduced by 1%. Then what will happen? When CRR is reduced to 3%, 90,000 crores. Please remember, I have already told you the entire deposits with banking system is 90 lakh crores. 1% of 90 lakh crores is 90,000 crores, and 90,000 crores will flow from Reserve Bank to banking system. 90,000 crores will flow directly from the special account of Reserve Bank of India directly into the banking system, and that money will be available for lending. That's why more money will be there into the circulation, and therefore which will create demand for more goods, so GDP will grow. So, by reducing CRR or SLR, more money will go for circulation with the banks. So, by reducing CRR or SLR, more money will go into the banking system, right? So, if CRR is reduced slightly, then more money will be available in the banking system for lending, and ultimately it will result in GDP growth, right? So, Reserve Bank of India, if it wants, can reduce CRR or SLR, and if they reduce SLR also, more money will be there in the banking system for lending, but by reducing SLR, that much effect may not be there because of the reason banks are keeping more than 21.5% in government securities, right? But if CRR is reduced, straight away that money will flow into the banking system and more money will be available for circulation and GDP will grow. So, this is what is known as monetary expansion. If you look at the second one, policy rates, repo rate. Repo rate is if banks are borrowing from Reserve Bank of India for day-to-day requirements, that is the interest rate charged by RBI on banks. That is the repo rate. Reverse repo rate. If banks are parking excess money with Reserve Bank of India, interest paid by Reserve Bank of India to banks is reverse repo rate. Then marginal standing facility. This is the second window of borrowing made available from Reserve Bank of India to various banks, but with higher interest rate. Then bank rate, this is for long duration loans from Reserve Bank of India. So, these are the policy rates. Reserve Bank of India fixes these policy rates. If Reserve Bank of India reduces these policy rates, then it will have effect in the overall lending interest rates, then more money will flow and credit offtake will be more from the banking system. So, what I mean to convey is, if these policy rates are reduced by Reserve Bank of India, then what will happen? More money will go for lending. That means people will borrow more money. That means the credit offtake from the banking system will be more. Ultimately, more money in the hands of the people, more demand and more production, more GDP. This is what happens when more money is there in circulation, right? So, by reducing reserve ratios and at the same time by reducing policy rates, Reserve Bank of India can put more money into circulation, right? And because of monetary expansion, please look into this slide, because of monetary expansion, more money will be borrowed from the banking system by people, by companies, and because of which then country's GDP will grow, right? So, in a nutshell, any country's GDP will depend on three things. The country's GDP depend on three things. One is the fiscal policy, the quality of money being spent by government, how much money government is spending on productive assets, on capital assets. Second important point is structural bottlenecks in the economy, how the country is faring. If you look at the country from the perspective of education, health, research and development, time taken for arbitration, mechanism for bringing companies out of stress, then tax policies in the country. So, these are all the issues which matter a lot when it comes to GDP growth. The third important point is the first two are in the hands of Government of India, and the third one or the last one is monetary policy, that is putting more money into circulation, that is in the hands of Reserve Bank of India. So, fiscal policy, structural bottlenecks, that is government's lookout. Then this monetary policy is the lookout of Reserve Bank of India to put more money into circulation. Right friends? It is $1 million question whether Raghuram Rajan ready for monetary expansion by reducing reserve ratios or policy rates. Only time can say. Right? Right friends, we have discussed in detail about monetary expansion, and next week we will discuss some other topic. Have a nice day. Thank you.